Hello. My thanks to the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center for inviting me to speak on the issue of commercial space standards and share some of my perspectives and our ongoing activities related to that. As we can all appreciate, space is absolutely integral to our lives, spanning all government and private sectors. The U.S. has a majority of spacecraft applications in the bow wave of large constellation spacecraft initiatives, an investment that will undoubtedly lead to socioeconomic applications and technological progress in agriculture, banking, navigation, communications, and Earth remote sensing. But that also means that the U.S. must work to ensure the sustainability of space as a vital resource. Today, I'd like to share my perspectives on the role that commercial best practices can play in that important endeavor throughout the space life cycle. I want to start by mentioning that our U.S. standards strategy is in stark contrast with standards development initiatives in other countries, with our emphasis on commercially driven standards. And given the level of achievement in the commercial spacecraft and SSA markets, it's easy to understand why this emphasis exists. Yet while good, this can make it a bit more difficult for the U.S. to develop a cohesive set of standards and regulations. It could potentially dilute U.S. participation in international consensus building processes, national government standards development activities, and U.S. engagement in helping to establish consensus space standards within standards development organizations, or SDOs, that have a well-established record of developing space standards, such as ISO and CCSDS. Unless carefully coordinated, it's also possible to have an unhealthy competition and divergence of codified best practices within SDOs. As if this weren't challenging enough, the U.S. has different government standards for civil, military, and commercial sectors as captured by NASA, U.S. Air Force, and FAA. The point of this slide is to say that the U.S. approach, while being a fair and open tent in nature and promoting the space industry, does present some complex challenges that must be carefully managed. I think that we are on the cusp of understanding these challenges, with multilateral liaison groups forming and information sharing beginning to hopefully help us to address these challenges. Space has always been a challenging environment, perhaps never more so than today. Comprehensive space safety must address physical safety, communication safety, security, and space weather awareness. Physical safety includes avoiding launch and on-orbit collisions, minimization of human casualty or asset loss from spacecraft or debris reentry, and the long-term sustainability of the space operations environment. Communication safety includes minimizing the incidence and severity of radio frequency interference events. Cybersecurity is also of increasing performance. Space weather is, and always has been, a challenge to maintaining accurate space situational awareness and protecting the mission. And finally, I'd throw in there that the increasing scope and complexity of space activities presents challenges in and of itself, because in today's new space era, we are flying many more spacecraft, introducing more debris, tracking more debris via commercial SSA systems, and better analytics than ever before. Today, our space activities are also rapidly changing, becoming increasingly complex and intricate. To illustrate this increasing complexity, plans have now been filed to build, launch, and operate over 107,000 spacecraft just within the next 10 years alone. This animation is based on the 107,000 spacecraft applications filed with the ITU and the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, or in a few cases announced in the media. While we fully realize that only a portion of these applications will yield an operational spacecraft, even if only 20% of these constellations are realized, we could easily see an active spacecraft population in the next decade that is 10 times larger than is flying today. This year alone, we could see the active space population nearly double. Cybersecurity is critically important. I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but I was privileged to be a co-panelist with Matthew Scholl, Chief of Computer Security at the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. I learned from his intervention that encryption standards that NIST develops protect not only U.S. government systems, but they are also widely embraced by commercial industry and our international partners. According to Matthew, space systems that use encryption ciphers and key management protocols have historically been built without the concept of cryptographic agility. While these are highly effective in protecting your data and businesses today, the near-term introduction of quantum computing will soon render them ineffective in the next 8 to 10 years, he estimates. In order to avoid building space hardware that is technically obsolete before it is even launched, cryptographic agility should be viewed as a requirement. NIST is currently working to develop new suites of crypto technology. These new encryption standards will come online, he estimates, between 2022 and 2025. Now, the US recently released its Space Policy Directive 5. It was on 4 September of this year. Consistent with Matthew's warnings, SPD 5 states that it is critical that cybersecurity measures, including the ability to perform updates and respond to incidents remotely, are integrated into the design of the space vehicle before launch, as most space vehicles in orbit cannot currently be physically accessed. Now, you might be wondering, in addition to those cybersecurity standards, what other international space standards already exist. Oftentimes, it's easy to see the treaties and guidance that have been developed by the United Nations Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. But note that these valuable documents are not actually standards. To find standards, we must turn to standards development organizations, or SDOs, such as the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, the Consultative Committee for Space Data Standards, or CCSDS, and others. Before we dig too deep into standards, we should discuss the need to develop consensus definitions of space-relevant terms. Terms must be standardized before we can employ them to author meaningful standards, and I've noted not more than once how many standards organizations struggle with terminology. I'm pleased to report that recently, within the auspices of ISO, CCSDS, ASTM, and AIAA circles, we've been working to harmonize terminology. Specific to ISO and CCSDS, we've now identified an online portal for harmonizing and sharing our terms and definitions, and we are now actively working to align that content. ISO standards directly support and align with UN COPUOS long-term sustainability guidelines, as denoted by the green-filled cells in this table. The way to interpret this is to look at Subcommittee 13, where data messages are standardized, and Subcommittee 14, where operational best practices and management practices are standardized. And these clauses out here denote the numbering used in the latest version, approved version of the long-term sustainability guidelines. Let's now examine where within the ISO framework space-related standards are developed. ISO Technical Committee 20, Subcommittee 13, which is also shares a duality with Consultative Committee for Space Data Standards, develops comprehensive international space data message standards. Sharing of space data such as orbital information, close approach parameters, tracking data, attitude data, reentry, and sensor pointing parameters is enabled by the SC13 family of Navigation Working Group standards. ISO Technical Committee 20, Subcommittee 14 develops comprehensive international standards codifying space systems best practices and expected norms of behavior. Now, turning to the commercial side, the Commercially Self-Formed Space Data Association, or SDA, has been operational now for more than a decade. The SDA provides safety of flight services spanning all orbital regimes to 30 operators who collectively fly 680 spacecraft. It was formed to address perceived critical shortcomings in space safety, and it pioneered many of the data lake, crowdsourcing, and algorithmic approaches that many now understand to be fundamental to comprehensive spaceflight safety systems. The Space Data Center that we manage for the SDA provides geographic diversity, computational security, a robust legal framework, very high availability, ongoing forensics, data quality checks, and comparative SSA analyses. The SDA has also evolved to be one of the largest global clearinghouses for spacecraft operator data. The Space Safety Coalition is a coalition of the willing, with like-minded companies and entities working to develop, publish, and maintain a set of orbit regime agnostic best practices for the long-term sustainability of space operations. You can find them at spacesafety.org. Through initiatives such as this and the Satellite Industry Association, the commercial space industry can make a positive impact on LTS by self-regulation in advance of space governance treaties, consensus guidelines, standards, and national regulations. At its inception, the Space Safety Coalition comprised 18 space organizations. Since that time, participation has more than doubled, with 45 space operators and relevant global industry stakeholders from 12 countries having endorsed this industry-led view of the current set of policies and best practices for space operations sustainability. Participants represent a diverse set of organizations from across the global space enterprise, including foundations, industry associations, analytical service providers, legal firms, space insurers, on-orbit servicing, active debris removal companies, space situational awareness and STM service providers, launch providers, manufacturers, and spacecraft operators. Although non-normative, these best practices are generally applicable to all spacecraft regardless of physical size, orbital regime, or constellation size. In advance of treaties and regulations, signatories endorse and agree to promote and strive to implement SSC best practices to ensure the safety and commercial viability of space activities. Perhaps you're now wondering, with all of these existing international standards and commercial best practices, what remains to be done and how you can help, right? For one, we need forums just like this ISAC meeting to share and promote both international standards, industry best practices, and government approaches. Over time, we can achieve the steady, incremental consensus building that's necessary to achieve true flight safety. Secondly, more work remains. This chart reflects Space Safety Coalition broad categories of best practices, with blue bars indicating current practices, yellow reflecting new prioritized development, and clear denoting additional planned content. But this is primarily a space industry-centric depiction of what's required for safety. Additional standards for increasing space efficiency also exist. In conclusion, we all know that we depend upon space capabilities in all facets of life. We face many challenges and threats, as well as growing complexity in space. Many commercial best practices, standards, and treaties already exist, as codified by industry associations, commercial industry, and government participation in SDOs and national regulations. But more needs to be done at all levels in a holistic manner, so that we don't have to find out the hard way just how much we rely upon that space. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.